Greetings to all of you. I'm Sister Pat Millen, a sister of St. Francis of Philadelphia and a member of the Franciscan Federation JPIC committee. And before we begin our presentation, I do have a few instructions, and I'm going to ask you to continue to keep yourself muted until we get to the question and answer time. I'm also going to ask you to turn off your camera. And I have two reasons to ask you to do that. One, it does help with the presentation, but I also want you to know that, and perhaps you didn't realize this, but by turning off your camera, you're helping to reduce your carbon footprint by 96%. At the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box. We're going to ask that you place your questions, comments in the chat box, and there will be time for question and answer after the presentation. This presentation is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Federation website. We want to make sure everybody has a chance to listen to this very important and critical presentation this evening. Sister Carol Woods, co-director of the Franciscan Federation, will lead us in prayer, introduce Jason Miller, our presenter, and Sister Marianne Mueller, who's the chair of the JPIC committee, will facilitate questions and answers. Again, please remember to put your comments, your questions in the chat box. Again, we'll have time for questions and answers after the presentation. Sister Carol? Sister Carol will now lead us in prayer.
O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us as a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus, so to discover the Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. May we discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that you, our God, loves. Amen. It is my pleasure now to introduce Jason, who is here with us from Franciscan Action Network. Jason is a faith-based advocate and organizer, originally from Toledo, Ohio. He earned his BA in History and Religious Studies, then served with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in Nashville, Tennessee, working in Catholic Charities Refugee Service. Wanting to study conflict analysis and resolution, he went to Washington to George Mason University to complete his master's degree. He is now the Director of Campaigns and Development at Franciscan Action Network, while he also serves as the co-chair of the Faithful Democracy Washington Interfaith Staff Community. This is a network of over 70 Washington offices of national religious bodies and faith-based organizations, which collaborates on advocacy for U.S. government policies. Jason, we look forward to hearing your perspectives. Faith, history, focus on people, our country, and our planet. On interfaith collaboration, modern means of communication, advocacy, and a hunger for peacemaking. It is no wonder to me that you credit your confirmation saint, Francis of Assisi, for getting you here. Welcome. We're glad to welcome you, Jason. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sister Carol. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and a pleasure to see some familiar faces, including some of my friends from the Sylvania Franciscans and others that I recognize as well. And I was excited to hear that if you turn off your camera, you reduced your carbon footprint by 96%. So the next time Sister Marie Lucy asks us on a fan staff call, why is your camera not on? I'll say, because I'm reducing my personal carbon footprint. So I was excited to hear that. So let's get started. I'm gonna try to share my screen here and we'll see how successful I am. Okay. So where do we go from here? Confronting white supremacy with the Franciscan heart. First, a little bit about who I am. Sister Carol was gracious enough to mention my work at FAN and with the Faithful Democracy Coalition. We advocate for voting rights and getting big money out of politics. But I'm here tonight to talk about issues of race and white supremacy. And first, I need to recognize my privilege. I'm a white, cis, heterosexual male, and I'm educated almost all of my life in Catholic private schools. And because of my circumstances in life, I'm not an expert on this topic, and we have a long way to go together to address these issues. It's hard, but it's necessary. And I'm here to admit before we get started that in many ways, I benefit from white supremacy, just as many of you do who are on this call. So now that I've recognized my privilege and the fact that I've benefited from the system of white supremacy, I just want to say a word about FAN as well. Many of you are part of Franciscan religious communities that make up FAN's membership, and we are inspired by the gospel of Jesus and the example of Francis and Claire. We're a collective Franciscan voice seeking to transform U.S. public policy related to peacemaking, care for creation, poverty, and human rights. So as we look at FAN's makeup and the makeup of our Franciscan family, we have to also recognize privilege. During a recent FAN staff conversation, it was pointed out that the FAN staff is all white. The FAN board of directors is all white. And the ELFO, all of the directors are also all white. So how do we make combating white supremacy a priority in the Franciscan family when our membership, and in particular our leadership, is primarily white? Well, the first step is to talk about it, and that's why we're here tonight. So the objectives of this talk, we're going to use our friends Pope Francis and St. Francis as a guide, and we're going to examine how white supremacy is prevalent in the Catholic Church. I'm going to present historical and modern day examples of white supremacy in the Catholic Church. And hopefully by the end of it, I'll equip you with skills and resources to challenge the system of white supremacy. Now, as I said, this is going to be challenging, and we have to be okay with being uncomfortable as we look at the system of white supremacy. So what exactly will we talk about? I think when we often think of what white supremacy is, we think of the picture here on your screen. We see one of the January 6th Capitol insurrectionists with a Confederate flag walking through the Capitol. When we think of white supremacy, this is who we think of. But tonight I'm going to define white supremacy and Christian nationalism. I'm going to look at the examples of Francis and Francis. We're also going to examine the Catholic Church's role in white supremacy and look at modern day examples of white supremacy in the Catholic Church and beyond, and hopefully give you some solutions to combat white supremacy. So first, what is white supremacy? It's in some ways difficult to define. Different scholars define it in different ways. So the Challenging White Supremacy workshop out of San Francisco says that white supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white peoples and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. Put simply by Kiara Bridges in the New York Times, it's white people who are winning and people of color who are losing. So, as I said earlier, who do we think of when we think of white supremacists? We think of people at the Capitol with the Confederate flag. Core beliefs of white supremacists include xenophobia and anti-Semitism, and they have a strong component of Christian nationalism. You may have seen in the news just this week, the FBI has accused the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, two of the groups who were at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and also at the January 6th insurrection, of planning that attack ahead of time and helping to escalate the rally into an attack. You see here in the picture, this was not at the US Capitol, this was at the state capitol in Lansing. This is a group of Proud Boys. You can tell by the black and gold that they are wearing. They are erecting a cross at the Capitol in Lansing, at the state capitol. So there are strong ties to Christianity and to Christian nationalism when we talk about white supremacists. And why are we seeing all of these groups all of a sudden? Why does it appear that they seem to be gaining steam? Well, perhaps it's because census estimates conclude that the US will be minority white by 2045. So how does Christian nationalism play a role in white supremacy? I said that Christian nationalism and white supremacy are intertwined in a lot of ways, but these are big terms that are perhaps complicated to understand, and different scholars define them in different ways. Well, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry says that Christian nationalism is a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life, and includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormity, along with divine sanction for authoritative control and militarism. It is as ethnic and political as it is religious. So when we see these prominent groups at the January 6th insurrection, at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, they are white supremacists They believe in the superiority of white people over other races, but they also have strong Christian nationalist components. Here's at the US Capitol on January 6th, rally attendees who had a cross there. Some of the people that stormed into the Capitol prayed before they went through the senators' desks in the Senate floor. So there's this fusion of Christianity and as Whitehead and Perry say, American civic life. It's almost in some ways indistinguishable. Ultimately, what it is in some ways is a distortion of religious liberty. Is this idea that a American Christian way of life is somehow under attack. What that really means is that a white supremacist way of life is under attack, and ideals that are sort of held up as American but are really white are potentially going away in a more diverse society. And that's what a lot of these folks are afraid of when they say that they're afraid of, you know, their way of life changing. So now that we've gotten past some of these, in some ways, difficult academic concepts, what do we do? Who do we look to examples of instead of white supremacists and Christian nationalists? Well, we want to follow the examples of Francis and Francis, right? So how do I view Francis? Some of you on this call may recognize the wonderful mural there of St. Francis at the Franciscan Center at Lourdes University in Sylvania, Ohio. That was probably my the first time I had ever seen Francis. And every time we drove by out to my grandparents' house, I would see Francis there up on the building. And I view Francis as more than just the guy in your garden who talks to animals, right? That's, I think, how a lot of people think Francis is. But to me, Francis was really one with all of creation. He advocated for peace and interreligious understanding. There was an article in the New Yorker from a few years ago, said that Francis believed that to obey Jesus, you had to join those who were abandoned. And I often wonder in our work at Franciscan Action Network, are we really following the radical example of Francis? Someone who was not afraid to go talk to the Sultan during the Crusades, who was not afraid to work with lepers. Are we really following that radical example? Well, here's someone who I do believe, to the best of his ability, is following that radical example. It's Pope Francis. Of course, he would take the name Francis as his papal name. I often tell people, as someone who is Jesuit educated but works for the Franciscans now, that was a brilliant political move by Pope Francis, being a Jesuit but taking the name Francis. He was 5 steps ahead of everyone on that. And one of his most famous quotes that we always hear about, right, is meeting those people on the margins. Well, who are on the margins and why are they there? What exactly does that mean? And many of you, of course, through your ministries, probably meet people on the margins every day. But do people, Catholics in the pews, are they meeting people on the margins? Olga Segura, who's a NCR op-ed writer, and she was on a webinar for NCR, for National Catholic Reporter. She asked, what does it mean to go to the margins and meet people where they are if we don't actually encounter them? And who are the people on the margins? Well, for the purposes of this talk, the people on the margins are the less fortunate, but they're also people who don't benefit from the same systems and structures that you or I might benefit from. So in this instance, that means people of color can often be on the margins, especially in our church. So what does it mean to meddle in politics? This is another famous quote by Francis, right? He was going to meet people on the margins and we're going to meddle in politics. Well, this is sort of a motto around the fan office, right? And Pope Francis says that a good Catholic meddles in politics, and that politics, according to the social doctrine of the church, is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. And when we advocate for those on the margin, that's really what we think about. It's, you know, making sure that their needs are met, but it's also advocating so that we can make sure that the government and organizations are able to meet the needs of people. So we often hear about life issues and we wonder, is addressing racism a life issue? Well, again, Pope Francis, he always has a quote for what we need. And after the horrific police killing of George Floyd last year, Pope Francis said that we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. So what Pope Francis is saying is that, you know, if we truly are a pro-life people, if we truly are being consistent, then yes, we need to address racism and address police brutality. John Gehring and Janine Isler from Faith and Public Life, we work with a lot. They had a op-ed in NCR that said that, of course, systemic racism is a pro-life issue. And if Catholic leaders are willing to hit the streets, carry banners, and lobby lawmakers for the unborn, they should also be pouring out of churches to resist the assault on Black and brown bodies. And perhaps that statement is somewhat surprising. Perhaps this picture of Bishop McElroy with a Black Lives Matter sign you take a step back when you see it, because in fact, it's not something we see quite often. Perhaps you've heard from people in the pews that organizations like Black Lives Matter are anti-Catholic or anti-family or anti-Christian. And, you know, that's really not true. Really what they're trying to do is to say that, you know, Black Lives Matter in its purest sense, and that we need to stop police brutality. And when we say Black Lives Matter, what that really means is that we're, again, meeting people on the margins and truly meeting them. So now that we've looked at our examples of Francis and Francis, let's take a deep breath and take a long, hard look at the Catholic Church's role in white supremacy. This is the part where I said it might start to get difficult. So again, if it's helpful to take a breath, I'm going to take a drink of water, do that now. So what was the Catholic Church's role in chattel slavery? Well, I mentioned my friend Olga Segura from NCR. She has a new book coming out, and I just started reading it. I would highly suggest it. I'll mention it again in a few slides. But right in the foreword to her book, Tia Pratt, who has a PhD and has been studying race in the church for the last 20 years, she mentions right off the bat, the birth of the Catholic Church was commingled with the slave trade in North America. And in fact, the Catholic Church introduced chattel slavery in the United States. And some of you may have read the bishop's statement that we sent around in the link. Yes, that's a good start, but today the Catholic Church, you know, won't officially recognize systemic or institutional racism. And a Washington Post article mentioned, and I have all of these sources at the end of my presentation, so you will be able to find them, I promise, that the Catholic Church morally sanctioned and actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of African men, women, and children. And this was from the start of the Catholic Church's entry into North America. And even in later centuries, often the Catholic bishops in the United States would condemn the slave trade, but not condemn slavery itself. If we take a look here at a quote by someone we know well, Christopher Columbus, in fact, as some of you know, a secular Franciscan. He's part of the Franciscan family. And often people try to excuse away people like Christopher Columbus. But he said that native peoples would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them and make them do whatever we want. In fact, Christopher Columbus did participate in slavery, and that is something we need to recognize today. And you can make the argument that he was a product of his time, but certainly there were people that understood that subjugating others and forcing them to be your slave was just not the Christian thing to do, even back in 1492. Well, I mentioned Christopher Columbus. What about the church's treatment of native peoples? Well, I'm gonna pick on another fan colleague of mine, Sister Maria, who I know is on this call. And for years she lived in New Mexico, and she would always wonder, well, why are the natives in New Mexico so poor? And for some reason, the U.S. government always seems to have money for warplanes and bombs. But she is part of what we call, as I'm part of Faithful Democracy, she's part of the Native American Working Group here in DC with some of these interfaith organizations and congregations that we work with. And one of the people in her group said that there's a saying that the Natives Americans are always competing against the bear, meaning that there is always a pot of money, and for some reason, Native peoples in the United States, that money either goes to them or it goes to wildlife. And we wonder, how she wondered, living in New Mexico, well, how can this be? Well, again, it started at the beginning. It's a culture of white supremacy that started with, again, our friend Christopher Columbus. We see him here with some native peoples that he brought back to Ferdinand and Isabella, and their gold. And who is in the corner? Well, to me that looks like a Franciscan. So another deep breath. Here's a difficult one. What do we do as Franciscans about Juniper SERRA? Well, this was, as many of you know, a hotly contested issue. And a few years ago, when Pope Francis made SERRA a saint, and then again in this past year, as Confederate statues started to come down, and then we saw that in California, people tried to take down statues of SERRA. And well, why exactly was that? You'll see here that you see in this picture that one of his statues was defaced. Well, according to National Catholic Reporter, yes, he's considered the founding father of California, but Native Americans were pressed into forced labor, mistreated, and infected with diseases that they had no resistance to. Those who were brought into the missions were not allowed to leave, and if they tried to flee, they were severely beaten. And when SERRA, right before he was canonized, one of the Native leaders wrote to Pope Francis and said that, he killed between 9,000 and 14,000 of our ancestors, and that triggered a collapse of our indigenous societal structure and way of life, and set into motion the atrocities and hardships that our people endured for nearly 2 centuries. And we know that the historical record, it appears mixed on SERRA, but part of recognizing white supremacy is listening to people of color. And the Native people say that, SERRA was not such a good guy. And as Franciscans, we need to recognize that. So here's one more question as we examine the Catholic Church's historical role in white supremacy. Why is the doctrine of discovery still on the books? What is the doctrine of discovery? This is something that comes up often as we have at FAN monthly meetings of our Franciscan Solidarity tables. And as some of you know, the Franciscan family includes Episcopal Franciscans and Lutheran Franciscans, Ecumenical Franciscans, all part of the Third Order. Some of you might even be on this call right now. And the Episcopal Church and other mainline Protestant churches have repudiated the doctrine of discovery, but it's a series of papal bulls, and it's still on the books, still on the papal books. And the Washington Post says it's, based land ownership on Christian discovery. And the doctrine tried to negate indigenous people's right to the lands that they lived on. And it's not something that was used just back during Christopher Columbus's time. I thought it was interesting that the painting here's another cross being erected. It almost looked to me just like some of those crosses on January 6th. Again, it was this Christianity commingled with nationalism and just twisted and subverted in a way that just doesn't mix like it should. But the doctrine of discovery, it's still used today. It's been used throughout the US history as the United States has laid claims to different pieces of tribal lands. And, the US Supreme Court back in the 19th century, it said that the US were the original owners of the land and it was theirs for the taking and selling. And it wasn't just about land. It was as Christians and Catholics were conquering the new world, the goal was to also bring barbarous nations to the faith. So believing themselves to doing God's work, Catholic missionaries spread throughout the Americas, trying to destroy diverse aspects of indigenous culture. We saw this with SERRA, and we see this throughout our history. And unfortunately, it's something we need to talk about more as we come to terms with it. So, fortunately, white supremacy is not just something that's in the past. There are also modern day examples of Catholic white supremacy. Some of you may know this person here that spoke at the RNC, that's Abby Johnson. She recently got into a little bit of controversy because she was scheduled to speak at the Catholic University of America. And the reason why that was so controversial is because Abby Johnson has a mixed race son. And she said on Twitter that as her mixed race son that she adopted grows older, that the police should profile him because statistically, he'd be more likely to commit a crime. That's what Abby Johnson said. Well, that's one, not true. And two, we know it's a white supremacist way of thinking. And the Black Catholic Messenger, which is a new news source, just started at the end of 2020. If you're looking for Black Catholic news, I would check them out online. And, many students spoke up against the Abby Johnson's Zoom appearance at Catholic University. And, if someone is a white supremacist, the Black Catholic Messenger said, then that person wants white people to be supreme in all spaces and places, including in the church and in the pro-life movement. Abby Johnson has said other incendiary things on Twitter. She's essentially spoken out against the Pope on multiple occasions. And in fact, she was at the January 6th insurrection here in Washington, D.C. And, President Garvey at CUA tried to explain away that this would be similar to if Joe Biden spoke at CUA, but we know that that's just not true because the Black Catholic Messenger says that, hosting someone who promotes a racist ideology constitutes formal moral cooperation in the ideology of white supremacy. And that's beyond the pale. That's beyond the bounds of anything that we should be doing as Catholics. We should not be giving her a platform. Well, where did people like Abby Johnson come from? We know that there's the Catholic far-right media, as Rebecca Bratton-Weiss calls it, exists because of Rush Limbaugh, who you probably know passed away from cancer just last week. They tapped into a well of hatred that was already there, she said. And this well of hatred didn't just spring up with Abby Johnson. It didn't just spring up with Rush Limbaugh. There's, again, historical roots that we see that existed the moment Europeans stepped foot on the North American continent. They immediately tried to impose white supremacy. And Rebecca goes on to say that that's why anti-racist work is so important. We need to acknowledge the extent to which our participation in institutions that grant us power, she means as white people, that grant us power and privilege is a participation in white supremacy. So we are all complicit. And I'm not going to dignify some of the terrible things that Rush has said over the years, but you can see them for yourself. And I'll mention too that, you know, it didn't start with Rush. But there was an article in America Magazine that notes that, you know, Catholic media had Father Coughlin in the 30s. You know, he was anti-Semitic, he was nativist, he supported Hitler essentially. And so we have our own instances in our Catholic Church in the US of upholding ideas of white supremacy and nativism and anti-Semitism. And unfortunately that continues today. So again, we're hearing all of these voices of Abby Johnson, of Rush Limbaugh, but you know, and are people listening to Pope Francis? Are they listening to Saint Francis? We know that we are, but are people in the pews listening to them? But if they're not listening to Pope Francis, who are they listening to? Just in the same ways that we need to be aware of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, we need to be aware of who folks in the pews might be listening to. Well, they're listening to QAnon. How many of you are familiar with QAnon? It's a conspiracy theory that is sort of religion-esque. It uses similar language. It draws people in with talking about saving the children, but really it's conspiracy theories that are detrimental. Unfortunately, people in the pews are listening to folks like Church Militant, LifeSite News, Abby Johnson, who we've talked about, Father Z, who you might not know, he has a popular blog. He was performing exorcisms to stop the steal of the election. We're listening to Cardinal Vigano, and they're listening to Father Frank Pavone, who has been very vocal on Twitter in support of Trump, even after the inauguration. So, whew, deep breath. How do we combat all of this white supremacy? What can we do? You might be feeling a little in despair after everything I've talked about. Well, hopefully here I can give you some tools and resources. So what US Black Catholic voices should we be listening to instead? I mentioned the Black Catholic Messenger. They're pretty new, but it's was started by a Black seminarian and gives voice to all sorts of diverse Black Catholic voices. I mentioned the book by Olga, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church. It just came out in Orbis Books. No, they did not pay me to promote that. I just think that everyone should read it. I got it in the mail and not on Amazon, and I got it through another site. And as soon as I started reading that foreword by Tia Noel Pratt, I started to change pieces of my presentation because I realized that there was so much and there was pieces that I was missing that we needed to hear. So I would highly suggest that book. And Tia Noel Pratt even goes further. There's a very long Black Catholic syllabus that is on her website that you could spend the rest of your life reading from Black Catholic voices. And you know, this book is new, the Black Catholic Messenger is new, and we know that these voices of people of color exist in the church, especially and I'm speaking specifically in the US, but do we as white Catholics in the US know where to look? Do we even bother to look? And that's why hopefully some of these resources would be a good place for you to start. Now, our new favorite Catholic, Amanda Gorman. Is she a new US Black Catholic prophet? I think she caught the whole nation by surprise on Inauguration Day, and what a pleasant surprise it was. There was a recent article in the Washington Post that said that Gorman brought forward a revolutionary and womanist tradition of Black Catholicism that far too many people deny exists. She also powerfully reminded her nation and church that Black women and girls are some of the most formidable prophets of democracy and Catholicism, if only they dare to listen. And we certainly listened to Amanda that day on Inauguration Day, and that reminded us that we need to listen to her, and we need to listen to other Black Catholic voices as well. What about reparations? We've heard a lot about white supremacy in the Catholic Church and how the Catholic Church was complicit in chattel slavery and the slave trade. Well, I have some good news. So you may have heard that Georgetown University, they had 272 enslaved men and women that were sold by the school's Jesuit founders to help found Georgetown. And that included, unfortunately, the first Bishop of the United States, John Carroll. And as a John Carroll graduate, that hurts just a little bit more. But the good news is the students at Georgetown, you may have heard, voted to create a fund to support the descendants. So it was a $27.20 student fee. And there was a reason for that number. I can't, oh, it's because it was 272. There you go. That's, it's that liberal arts education. That fee generated roughly $400,000 annually to support the descendants of these enslaved people that were sold by the Jesuits. So there is some good news here. The younger generations, they're paying attention to our history, and they're realizing that we need to right some of the wrongs of our past. This move for reparations didn't come from the Jesuits. It didn't come from the school administrators. It came from the students, and they put it to a vote, and the vote passed. So to wrap things up, how can you and I confront white supremacy with a Franciscan heart? Well, there's two lists here, right? And one of them is sort of interpersonal. The other is sort of big picture ideas. So here's one idea, a land acknowledgement. So whose native land do you live on? There's a website that you can go to that allows you to type in your address, and it tells you whose land you live on, which native peoples used to be on this land. You can explore and be honest about your own family's history. Many of us perhaps don't know our family's history and perhaps how we were complicit in some of these sins of the past. You can speak out against racism, especially among your family and friends. That's hard to do at Thanksgiving dinner, but it's necessary, right? And it's again a step in being okay with being uncomfortable. We can support local and small businesses owned by people of color, and we can follow their lead, but we also have to remember not to ask people of color to do all of the work, right? We can look to Amanda Gorman as a voice, but we can't expect her to dismantle the system of white supremacy herself. It's up to us. So what are some of these big picture things that we can do? Well, we can elevate people of color to positions of power, and perhaps within our own Franciscan family, we need to look at ways in which we can do that, as I said earlier. We can support bills like HR 40 and HR 51. Well, what are HR 40 and HR 51? HR 51 is the DC statehood bill. There are over 700,000 people here in DC, a majority Black city, that do not have full representation in Congress. And it would be great to have senators again, just selfishly, I'll say. HR 40 is the reparations bill, and it was reintroduced in Congress this year. I learned recently that that's been introduced in every Congress since the 1980s. Perhaps some of you heard about the 1619 project. We can use that project in religious education. And if I can just say a word too about the 1619 Project, some of you probably saw that timeline of racism that we had in some of the resources. We think of 1619 as the year that, you know, slavery started here in the US, but actually the Catholic Church started it before that in Spanish Florida in 1565. So it really, the 1619 Project perhaps should be the 1565 Project. And again, that's something as Catholics and as Franciscans we need to take a long, hard look at. And using the 1619 Project in religious education would be a good start. We can advocate for U.S. Black Catholic saints. Do you know that there are no U.S. Black Catholic saints? We were talking a little bit about the contributions, especially of women religious and women religious of color throughout history in the United States, how they educated so many people. And that was something that I wanted to touch on a little bit today, but couldn't quite fit it in. But there are no U.S. Black Catholic saints. Think of Julia Greer or Thea Bowman to name some Franciscans, but there's others as well, obviously. And ultimately, we need to work together to make the church anti-racist. And as you saw, that's a tall order, but we've already started by speaking about that today. And hopefully you can continue on with me as we continue to dismantle the system of white supremacy, both in our church and in the United States. So there's our contact information. Hopefully you are all on the FAN e-newsletter that you get every Monday. If not, please sign up at our website, franciscanaction.org. Follow us on Facebook, even if you happen to be on Twitter or Instagram. And then you can also connect with me. My information is there. And here are all my sources, as I promised, that do exist. And again, it's that good liberal arts education, and we will be sharing these slides.
Jason, thank you. I'm so happy this is being recorded because you gave us a lot of new information, and we can't dismantle racism or even begin to dismantle racism or dismantle privilege unless we know the history or our history. So thank you. I've been following the chat box, and somebody recommended the, which I can't get to right now. Somebody recommended Brian Massengale's book also. I believe it's called The Catholic Church and Racism.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
And then also, if you can get into the chat box, somebody, Margaret McGee, provided a link to a video on the doctrine of discovery. But if anybody has any questions, you could either just raise your hand, or that would probably be the best way of doing this.
Yeah, and I see one on here. So yeah, I didn't talk about white privilege, and I did talk about white supremacy. Initially, some of my talk focused on white privilege. I think that that's something that, you know, in a lot of ways, those two ideas go hand in hand. And, you know, I recognized my privilege and the privilege of a lot of us as we started this conversation. But I thought it was more important to look at the bigger picture rather than the sort of perhaps the white privilege in some ways is more interpersonal or on a one-on-one level. You know, there's issues certainly like redlining and things that have, you know, benefited people individually. And again, that's an area sort of where white supremacy and white privilege sort of intersect. And so that's why I focused sort of on these big picture issues of white supremacy in the church, because that's really where our work at FAN is, as it sort of intersects with the political and the religious, looking at these big pictures.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, do you want to unmute?
Yes, Mark Charles has a wonderful YouTube on the doctrine of discovery and how racism is embedded in the Constitution because it was written by white males with property. So really look into that. It's an excellent presentation, very in-depth.
Jerry, could you just in the chat put the name down again so that
If I
everybody
can type
see?
fast enough, if you're
Good.
on long enough.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I'm not sure if that's the one that Margaret shared or not.
Yeah.
Because I know there was sort of a famous one. So
Thank you. Nancy, do you have a question? Nancy? Okay, your hand is up. Okay, and there's also another Chloe Becker, who's a young artist who has
Doctrine of discovery.
imaged a number of Black religious founders.
yeah, that's another piece. As I said, I wanted to dig a little bit more. I think that's just another example of white supremacy. You know, what does it take to be a saint? Well, it takes someone to start a campaign, and it takes money, right? You have to essentially petition the Vatican. Yes, obviously you need the miracles, but you also need the PR campaign behind you. And that's, again, I think an overlooked piece of our church that at least by, you know, folks like us that
yes.
we need to take a closer look at.
Can you tell me if there's anything that I...
Okay.
And that's to say too that, you know, I love all of the art that you see, that especially now that the internet allows so many more artists to get their message out there. And yeah, I love the iconography and sort of modern day, you know, things like that. So thanks for that suggestion.
Okay. And Pat Clem is recommending a video of Burma Myers on confronting our bias. Are you familiar with that, Jason?
I can't say that I am, but I do know that we are all biased, so I'm sure that it's good.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, this is, can you comment on the new African-American Archbishop?
Who would that be?
That is
Gregory.
Gregory.
Oh, it's Cardinal Gregory now. Yes. You know, it's really exciting to have Cardinal Gregory here in DC, where it's, you know, the city does have such a long history of African-American Catholics, and unfortunately, as we saw, a difficult history as well. So, you know, and he was recently on the Today Show talking about, you know, when he's not in his clerics, you know, he's just like any other Black man, and, you know, and can be, you know, profiled due to his race. So, you know, I think it's encouraging that he's here and he's speaking out on issues like that.
Okay, we have one question from Miriam, and then there's a question in the chat. Miriam?
I put it in the chat, but I want to raise it now so that you could identify what you might have already planned to do. And that would be, is this material going to be available and easy to access, as well as the chat comments and recommendations?
Yeah, and I know that we can save the chat, and we can share the slides. So
That would be great.
mhm.
And it will be recorded, and the link will be on the Franciscan Federation website.
The slides would be most helpful.
Yes.
Mhm.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
definitely. Yeah, I will share those. And can I speak more about supporting HR 51?
Yes.
Yes, I can, because that's what I do every day from 9 to 5. So, all right, that's a question I feel comfortable with. You know, I know for some people, right, they say, oh, well, the Constitution says that, you know, the District of Columbia is a special area. Well, yes, of course it is. But we also have over 700,000 people that are living here, and that's more than Vermont or Wyoming. So, you know, I think there are special, and I think the bill gets into this a little bit more. There are, you know, special carve outs that can be done, that, you know, you can carve out the federal areas and keep those, you know, federal areas as the Constitution states, but then ensure that the, you know, 700,000 plus people that live here in the neighborhoods are able to vote and get full representation. You know, DC for a long time, and it still is a majority Black city, although those numbers are decreasing a bit as more people move in. Unfortunately, I'm part of the problem there. You know, that is in some ways a way that of voter suppression, and we've seen, you know, throughout history, not just in the South, but all over the United States, that people of color that have been, you know, their votes have been suppressed and they've been disenfranchised. We're seeing there's over 160 new bills that are coming across state legislatures, especially in states like Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania. After what happened in the January 5th runoff, folks in Georgia are trying to ensure that people of color can't vote. And that's, you know, that's white supremacy in action, and it's an active form of voter suppression. And HR 51 is just another way to try to right the wrongs of the past and ensure that people of color and all citizens of DC have full and equal representation in our government. You know, the DC budget has to be approved by Congress. I mean, there's, you know, any sort of law that the DC passes, you know, it's DC sort of always used as a political hockey puck. And, you know, it's long past time that they're that we are allowed to make our own decisions here.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Well, I see we're over our time. And again, I just want to thank everyone for participating. And Jason, thank you again. I look forward to going back to the recording and the other information, the resources. When St. Francis was dying, some of his last words to his followers is the prayer I offer for all of us as we end this time together. Francis said, "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ show all of us, show you, what is yours, what is ours to do." Amen. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.